After the unprecedented whirlwind of events that led into last year's Ontario election, no one should be surprised about what a dramatic first year in office it has been for the Doug Ford government. Big programs scrapped, major realignments with some blowback, and a few climb downs that may or may not signal what's ahead. Here to reflect on the year that was, Adrienne Batra, editor-in-chief at the Toronto Sun; Regg Cohn, Ontario politics columnist at the Toronto Star; Fatima Syed, investigative reporter for the National Observer; and Matt Gurney, columnist and editor at the National Post, who also writes for our website, tvo.org. And it's great to have everybody here, I will say again, except for you. First time for you.
First time for me.
Nice to have you here. Let us remind everybody where we were 12 months ago. This is what the total vote count looked like on Election Day. The Conservatives had 41% of the vote share going back a year. The NDP, of course, becoming the official opposition at 34%. The Liberals with a big drop at 19%. The Greens winning their first and only seat at 5%. Let us fast forward a year. And look how the numbers have changed. The Conservatives have dropped nearly 18 points with just 22% support. The NDP have dropped a bit at 24%. The Liberals have surged back into the lead with nearly 40%. And the Greens appear to have doubled their support and more with 11.7%. And how about the personal popularity of the leaders? The green bars at the bottom show favorable opinion. Doug Ford's got less than 20% favorability rating right now. He has more than 73% of people with an unfavorable opinion of him. Andrea Horwath, the opposition leader, has the highest popularity numbers, a 50% plus favorable opinion, less than 30% unfavorable opinion. John Fraser, who's the interim leader of the Liberals, with a 20% favorability, most people not familiar with him. Mike Schreiner, 26% favorability, 45% or more unfamiliar with him. But clearly the big takeaway here is we have a premier who is personally unpopular. We have a governing party which has dropped significantly in popularity. And Regg Cohn is going to kick off our discussion of why that is.
Well, I think a year ago, Steve, people were mad as hell at the Liberals after 15 years in power and at Kathleen Wynne, who was monumentally unpopular. A year later, they don't have Kathleen Wynne to kick around anymore, and now they are focusing fully on Doug Ford.
But his numbers are even worse than hers.
Correct. Now that Kathleen Wynne's out of the way, they are focusing on Ford, and they're not happy with what they see. They're not happy with the changes, the mercurial disposition, the volatility. People want discipline, and they want a government that is more managerial than mercurial. And what they don't, a year later, his numbers are off the charts and still going down.
Adrienne, why are these numbers as bad as they are?
Well, I think the whole notion of doing the hard lifting in your first year of office is really coming to bear with this government. I mean, for 15 years, we saw overspending, mismanagement, political corruption from the Liberals. And so the Ford government is trying to, right the ship in that manner. And it takes a lot to do that, and sometimes very unpopular decisions. It's harder to say no than it is to yes with big spending and things like that. But the challenge they seem to have is this notion of populism versus fiscal conservatism. And right now, it's very popular to do certain things, like they did with the beer stores and the buck of beer, and for example. But the actual aligning the budget, fixing the fiscal challenges that Ontario has, is going to be difficult. And we're seeing that their messaging hasn't worked. They haven't communicated this well. And so I think, to Martin's point about the mercurial nature of them, that moving forward is one of the biggest challenges they need to fix.
Fatima, what do you see?
I think they've cut a lot of things, but they haven't built anything. I think the cupboard is still pretty bare, and I think that is hurting them in this year, in their first year. I think all Ontarians have seen is one cut after the other, without explanation, without proper justification.
Well, the justification was we have to balance the books. We have to spend less.
But I don't think they've been able to translate that in layman's terms to make sure that everyone understands. Like, how does one cut to an autism program, for example, contribute to lowering the deficit? We don't see the numbers properly. We don't understand it. And I think that's hurting the popularity of the government.
Matt, what do you see?
Well, what I see that I think the biggest problem is, and Adrienne has alluded to some of it, is like in theory, the government has a great case to make. We're going to get all the really unpopular stuff out of the way the first year. we'll do a shuffle like we just did, and then we have 3 years to the next election. Just in the abstract, that could end up working. With unpopularity levels like the Premier has, I'm a little more skeptical, but just as a game plan, it works. One of the problems, though, and I've been writing about this, is, as Adrienne says, they get out there, they do the announcement that's going to get people angry, they do the bad news, and then they retreat from it. So they end up absorbing all of the damage to popularity of having made the unpopular announcement, of having dug in and fought for it for weeks, having ministers go out, autism being a great example, Ms. McLeod defending that one for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, and then a total retreat. And then you just back right off of it. So you get all the damage of the having fought for weeks over something unpopular, but you don't get the advantage of actually being able to say, and this is what we've, the benefit, I should say, not the damage, of this is what we've accomplished for all the fighting.
But having said that, and this is the government's line, okay, this was our policy, you reacted, you people of Ontario reacted, you didn't like it, we've listened, and we've moderated our position. Governments are supposed to do that, are they not?
Well, let's circle back to that premise. You know, Mike Harris, a premier who ruled this province in the 1990s and came in with a very tough message and a very disciplined austerity approach to the finances of the province. He was not monumentally unpopular in his first year. He was controversial, but he got reelected.
With the same coalition.
So it isn't just that Doug Ford is clamping down on reckless spending. In fact, you could argue that this budget wasn't a clamp down on reckless spending. In fact, this budget is spending $5 billion more than Kathleen Wynne's last pre-election budget. So it isn't about messaging alone, although I agree with Adrienne, that's a big, big part of it if you're going one way today and the next way tomorrow. The challenge is to actually look like you know what you're doing. And I think that is Doug Ford's fundamental problem.
Adrienne, let me follow up on that, because the fact is a lot of Conservatives were very unhappy with the budget that Vic Fideli, when he was finance minister, brought out a couple of months back, because it does spend more than the Liberals' last budget did. And for a party that got elected in certain respects to restore the fiscal framework of the province, it didn't look like it did that.
Well, the Premier always likes to say the Toronto Star said they didn't spend enough, and the Toronto Sun says they spend too much. So maybe they did find a sweet spot with that actual budget when, you know, they did get some positive coverage, but it lasted. It was very short-lived. But I think the challenge sort of moving forward is that they still have 3 years before the next provincial election. They can rebuild. The Premier's popularity certainly it affects him. There's no question about that. It affects the caucus. It affects the government in general. But they have time. I mean, we're talking about the first year when difficult things need to be done. There still are bigger issues they need to deal with and to get the financial house in order. But Premier Ford has a style about him. There's no question about that. Ontarians knew that. Ontarians saw that.
What's the style?
Well, it's very much, you know, sometimes a bull that brings their own china shop with them. But it's far more measured than I think a lot of Ontarians anticipated. I think they thought it was going to be unruly. They did have memories of Mayor Ford, rest his soul. They did have this notion that it was going to be chaotic. It has been challenging, no question. But there is an art to governing versus campaigning. And they're learning, this government, not only the Premier, is learning that in a very hard way.
Can I just gently come back on that? I think people did know what they were getting with Doug Ford, and they didn't really want to think about it that much because they were more focused and fussed about Kathleen Wynne. You're right, he does have a long time ahead, 3 years. However, when you're in this kind of a tailspin, the pollsters will tell you it's very hard to pull out.
Well, especially with those numbers we've seen already, I wasn't looking at approve or disapprove. I was looking at no opinion or unsure. And for Doug Ford, there's not a lot of people who would fit either of that category. I mean, the Liberal leader right now, the interim Liberal leader, half the province doesn't know a thing about him or has no opinion about him. I don't recall exactly when those numbers were up on screen. For Doug Ford, it's what, 4%? Like he does not have a lot of room.
You're not undecided about Doug Ford. You're right, 4.2%. There it is. You're not undecided about Doug Ford.
And to Martin's point, you probably weren't before the election either. You just might have been able to set that aside. I mean, I have never known any Premier of Ontario in all the years I've been watching to come into office with so many people already having such strong opinions one way or the other about him.
Has he, from what you've been able to glean, changed from the guy who was elected on June 7th last year to the guy who's in the Premier's chair today?
I don't think he's changed, but I think he's learned. I think if we can see how he's rolled back on certain things, whether it's his approach to the green belt, whether it was the public health funding cuts, whether it was the cuts to municipalities, the fact that he had to roll back, I think he's been surprised by the reactions he's gotten. I don't think he expected that, and I think he's learned from it. And I think I have to disagree with the panel. I don't think Ontarians expected this. I think Ontarians voted for a guy who was not Kathleen Wynne, to Martin's point, but I don't think Ontarians voted for a haphazard blueprint of cuts. I don't think they expected, autism to be affected or for public health to be affected by when Doug Ford said that I'm going to reduce the deficit. I don't think that's what they thought it would look like.
Can I do a follow-up with you? Because you're kind of like the Daniel Dale who keeps track of every single lie that Donald Trump tells.
That's very kind.
You keep track of every single cut that the Ford government makes.
Yeah, I
what
made
are we
a
at
list.
right now?
I've lost count. I have lost count, but it's a very long list, and I still get emails from readers saying, hey, you forgot this and you forgot that, and there's some of them are very obscure and very small programs that I've never heard of that have lost their funding. I just heard one at Ryerson. There's a program that specifically researches labor practices that was started only a year ago as a pilot program that told me that they had lost their funding and that they wanted to be on the list.
But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we come into the province with a $15 billion deficit, huge debt. I mean, it's our third biggest spending envelope now. All those dollars that are going towards servicing that debt could be going to education, could be going to healthcare, but instead, the previous government spent and spent and spent. So yes, that one obscure program you're talking about may matter to those 2 or 3 people or those 10 people, but to the broader Ontario public, they're not thinking about it in such a micro manner.
But
they're thinking more broadly that this is a province that has financial challenges. Doug Ford is here to fix that mess, and they are on a path to do so. Perhaps not as fast as I'd like them to do it.
But in the big picture of things, when you see that small program as part of an extensive list of cuts across industry, across sectors, that just doesn't make sense to the average Ontarian.
Maybe those programs don't work.
But I think that
maybe they're ineffective. Maybe they're ineffectual.
Then
maybe
I think the government needs to communicate that better.
I don't disagree with you on that.
Matt.
Just in terms of the communication part of it, I would much rather be defending my cut to 1,000 programs or however many you're up to now that most of us, including you, hadn't previously heard of, than spend a month fighting with the parents of kids that have autism. I mean, that was just a complete disaster. I don't think, and this is one we haven't even touched on yet, we started with it, the fight to cut Toronto City Council. That was exciting here in Toronto. I've talked to friends and family in other parts of the province. They don't care. Like, they just view that as a Toronto issue, and they maybe, like, whatever their thoughts on it were, it didn't really stick with them. But when it came to the autism issue, the public health issue, those two fights have probably done more damage to the government than your entire list of smaller fights.
And don't forget the increases to class size. That affects everybody with kids in school in this province, and that was never discussed in the election campaign. Just briefly, what if it wasn't a $15 billion deficit? Because the auditor never said it was $15 billion, just Vic Fideli said it was $15 billion. No one else ever said that. So there is a false crisis narrative that has taken hold under this government that I'm not sure everybody believes. It wasn't $15 billion. The economy was and still is going quite strong, close to 2% growth. Unemployment at record lows before, during, and after the carbon tax and cap and trade. So there was a lot of hysteria that was part of the campaign hyperbole, which really doesn't accord with the facts.
So you want to quibble between 12 billion versus 15 billion? I mean, sure. it's still a big darn number. Yeah, and Ontarians wanted it fixed.
Especially with a healthy economy.
Exactly.
But if you drill down, and look at all the accounting changes that brought it up to 12 billion, suddenly Vic Fideli is the $6 billion man who
but also
brought
Kathleen Wynne was very responsible for a lot of
$6
those
billion
accounting
in accounting changes.
To make it look better.
Gang,
no one else even believes that. No one else believes are accurate.
This may be a good time just to. Had a big cabinet shuffle this morning, very big cabinet shuffle. And while we don't have to go through the ins and outs of every single person who changed portfolios and the new people who were brought in, there usually is an overarching story behind every cabinet shuffle. And I want to have some discussion about what you think that is. Matt, start us off.
Well, the one thing we've heard today so far, because it did happen this morning, but also in the days up to it, communication. Government doesn't communicate well. We've even been talking about that here on the panel. What I was saying to Adrienne just before we came on was the problem this government's going to have with communication, or looking to communication as its salvation, is that there is one really loud communicator in this government, and it's the guy at the very top of it. And Doug Ford likes to present things in maximalist terms. It's something that is amazing or it's terrible. He actually does have some good communicators in his government, and he actually has some probably who are now in more forward-looking positions. They've probably been put where they should have been. And I think, as we've been touching on here, not all of the changes that the Ford government has made have been massive or destructive. Some of them have, for sure, and they've taken damage for it. But I think you've got a government that has actually taken some modest, moderate steps, but doesn't have a moderate communicator at the top. So I want to see if communication actually improves for this government. Maybe he has learned, and I think that was a great way of putting it. He hasn't changed, but he's learned. One of the things he might have to learn is to let some of these good communicators do the communicating.
What's the story, Adrienne?
Well, maybe it's maybe not a reset, but a restart. In a way, to the broader point that I think all four of us are talking about with respect to communicating the message. You saw someone like Stephen Lecce, who used to work for Prime Minister Harper, was very effectual as the parliamentary assistant to the Premier, is now the Minister of Education.
He's 32 years old.
He's 32 years young. I mean, if you feel like you haven't accomplished much in your life. But this is a significant move because Stephen Lecce is very competent and capable at communicating these messages to the public. Education is a big file. Education is going to be, there's a lot of heavy lifting there. And so I think that was part of the move there. With respect to Rod Phillips going into finance, he performed very well and communicated the government's message quite effectively with respect to the carbon tax and fighting the federal government on that. Now he's in the role of finance. So that, I think, is a big part of putting strong communicators in your very significant positions, which are going to get a lot of media attention, and also notably with Todd Smith and moving Lisa MacLeod away, though she did the best she can in a very difficult portfolio. Not anybody can handle that. It's a very challenging.
Community and social services.
And now she's moved on to sport and trade. So this is a signal, I believe, that we need to realign and get back to the basics of what we were elected to do.
Fatima, what's the story of the shuffle?
I think the new cabinet is younger. I think that's important because you have people like Stephen Lecce, like Ross Romano, like Prabhat Sakaria, I hope I'm saying that right, who are very apt at social media messaging, who were always one of the first people in the PC caucus to, get on Twitter, make really interesting, engaging videos about messaging and get the word out to their constituents and Ontarians who follow them. And I think that might change things when it comes to communication. I'm not surprised by Rod Phillips' promotion at all. As someone who covers environment all the time, I think he's been an effective communicator for that file, for really delivering the government message on their climate action plan or lack thereof. So that's not surprising to me, but it's interesting to see a younger, more diverse, we have the first South Asian minister now in the Ford government, cabinet, and to see Ford, again, learning about the mishaps that happened in his first year and maybe trying to engage young people more now that he hasn't done that in his first year at all.
It is highly unusual to move your finance minister after one budget for a rookie government. Why did it happen?
Well, everyone's saying reset, restart. This is blowing up the cabinet. Let's go back to the narrative here of reality. It isn't just messaging or shooting the messenger in the media or social media, which hasn't worked after a year of more social media than I've ever seen before. Vic Fedeli, who likes yellow ties, so I'm in mourning today and wearing a yellow tie in solidarity.
Is that Pantone 109, though?
I don't know.
He doesn't just do yellow. It's Pantone 109. It's a particular shade of yellow.
63 yellow ties, and it hasn't helped him, and he'll blame yellow journalism for it all along. Look, the message here is it's all Vic Fedeli's fault, and that Doug Ford is innocent of all charges. The idea that a finance minister goes rogue and that the Premier and the Premier's office, which means his Chief of Staff, Dean French, didn't see this coming and it's all Vic's fault. Vic is a former mayor of North Bay and a very successful one at that. They screwed up by cutting transfer payments to municipalities midway through the fiscal year. How did that happen? Was that Vic's fault and Doug didn't see it coming, didn't know? Look, you and I both know, and everyone knows, that when the HST came along under the McGuinty government, that was driven by the Premier's office, and the finance minister didn't even see that coming. So you can't dissociate yourself from the finance minister unless you're simply undertaking a very careful damage control exercise. So this is a disruption as we've never seen before to try to rebuild.
Oftentimes in the past, when there are major cabinet shuffles, the premier and or his people think that, it's a terrible analogy, but sort of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic is going to, solve a problem. My hunch is 99% of Ontarians couldn't name more than 3 cabinet ministers in the government beforehand.
That's right. Exactly.
Maybe the problem is not communication. Maybe the problem is not wrong minister and wrong portfolio. Maybe the problem is the guy at the top. Doug Ford got booed at a Raptors celebratory parade. He got booed at the Special Olympics event. And if I know him as little as I do, I bet that hurt him. I bet that really hurt his feelings. If he's the problem, what do you do about that?
Well, I think anybody would be affected by being booed, frankly. But to all those Raptors fans that did, none of them know who Vic Fideli is. None of them know who Rod Phillips is.
But they're part of his coalition.
But they are, and that's really the challenge when I get back to that notion of the populism versus the conservatism. Premier Ford is affected by those sorts of things. He's affected by those individual phone calls he gets from those parents. He's affected by those people that pick up the phone and call his cell phone and he answers it and responds to them. And then there's a sudden shift in policy or there's a crawlback from some big announcement. They're not keeping Vic Fideli and Christine Elliott in caucus and in cabinet was very important today because they represent a coalition of the party and in that caucus that holds certain people together. So becoming economic development minister, by the way, for Mr. Fideli is not insignificant. I mean, it's a big file and there's a lot of work to do. But what to do about the premier? There's no good answer to that. None of us have that answer. He's the one that has to adjust and pivot based on what he sees is the public reaction.
Well, this is what I want to get to, because when you are 53% underwater in terms of your own popularity, at what point does the caucus, at what point does the cabinet consider some kind of intervention?
Well, I think that's some of the subtext of this cabinet shuffle as well, is you're looking at who would be the logical next premier of Ontario, assuming it's a progressive conservative premier. And there's a couple who come to mind, one of whom stayed in her job today and one of whom did not. And I think when you look at this, you have to wonder how much of this is about resetting the forward-facing agenda of the government and how much of it is the government, more specifically the premier's office, making sure its own caucus is in line. Because I was looking at those notes you have in front of you, the graphic we have there of the premier's popularity, and I'm thinking if you double his popularity, he's still underwater. And he's got 3 years. And I mean, through doubling your popularity in 3 years, okay. Yeah, let's be optimists. Let's say everything goes great from here on out. It could easily happen.
Sure.
But it's still a long way to go.
As my brother, the doctor, says whenever I complain, 2 things can happen. Things can get better or they can get worse.
Yeah.
So double the popularity or cut it in half at the current rate, which is exponentially downward.
Yeah.
But you asked, what can he do? He can stop pretending that he is the leader of Ontario's first government for the people. Never mind Mike Harris's government. He can stop pretending that he is the most popular populist ever, because he isn't. He's unpopular now. He's an unpopular populist, which is an oxymoron, last time I looked. He can stop pretending that beer is the most important issue facing this province today. And I say that as somebody who, as you know, made a lot of criticisms of the beer store arrangement, and then there was a deal for 10 years. Fine, let's wait till 2025. He can stop pretending that bucket beer or $1 billion to blow up that contract are the most pressing issues facing this province. Start getting honest and stop insulting the intelligence of Ontarians.
Well, those are all central to his brand. Making phone calls to constituents at 11 o'clock at night is part of who he is. Making beer more accessible to folks is very much about who he is. You're telling him not to be who he is.
Well, remember, Vic Fideli carried that baton for him. Vic Fideli talked constantly at Ford's behest about implementing that beer blow up and getting beer into corner stores. I don't see a clamor here. Go to Quebec if you have to. So I think by blowing up Vic Fideli, if I can put it that way, there was a recognition that that wasn't working, and you got to change something, and that's the easiest thing to change.
Fatima, what do you do when the leader of your government is 53 points underwater?
I think that he's fighting too many battles. And I think the one lesson that he hasn't learned that we're all waiting for him to learn is pick your battles. You can't fight the federal government in court over the carbon tax and municipalities over the notwithstanding clause. You can't fight parents of autism and also students who want climate action. You have to pick your battles, pick a direction that you want to go in, lay out a blueprint, and then stick to it. And I think that's something we're all waiting as Ontarians for him to lay out. And once he does that, maybe it'll shift in his favor.
I was looking just a few days ago to that exact point, reminding myself of something I lived through when I was in high school, which was the Mike Harris cuts, the huge job actions, the big strikes. And I couldn't remember because I was young and dumb and not paying attention, but I wanted to go look what actually happened. And after all of the protests, making the New York Times, teachers walk out in Ontario, Martin, you've already said it, he was reelected with basically an unchanged share of the vote because he picked his battles and he won them and he moved on. And it's not just about picking battles. I agree he has to do that. He has to win a couple. He's got to actually be able to put some points on the board in a way that the people of Ontario are going to go, you know what? We're glad this happened. Even if it's painful in the interim, we're glad that this has happened. And a little more facetiously, I was joking a few days ago that we'll know what their internals look like after the shuffle if we hear the announcement of 90-cent beer.
And I think, but that's it. I think it's an important point that they need to put a forward-facing public policy issue that is important to Ontarians and have a win. That matters. I think that the way that they are construing it, behind the scenes in the Premier's office and various ministers' offices, there have been certainly challenges. There have been a lot of fights, but that's inevitable of any government. And yeah, pick your battles, for sure. Focus on 2 or 3 big issues. But they are quite capable of tackling 10, 12, 15 things at once. That's the art of governing.
I got a list here.
That's what they need to
Let's go through some of them here, Adrienne, since the government does believe it has a good story to tell. It has had an extremely activist first year. And Sheldon, shall we? Let's put up this graphic here. They passed a bill to reduce the size of Toronto City Council to 25 members from 47 after threatening to use the notwithstanding clause. They dismantled the cap-and-trade program that launched a constitutional challenge against the federal government's carbon tax. They then released their own climate plan, which aims to entice companies to reduce their pollution. They launched education consultations and revamped the Ontario curriculum. The province will now have larger class sizes, mandatory e-learning courses. Students will learn about sex ed topics later than they would have under the previous Liberal government. They cancelled the basic income pilot. They pledged to have the province take over or upload the Toronto subway system. They shuttered the offices of the Environmental Commissioner, the Child Advocate, the French Language Services Commissioner. The Ombudsman and the Auditor General have now taken on those duties. They canceled plans for a French language university and several other satellite campuses from existing universities. They launched the famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, buck a beer. Bars are now allowed to serve liquor at 9 a.m. Municipalities able to permit drinking in parks. They ended the 10-year deal with the beer store so convenience stores could sell alcohol. They rolled out the sale of cannabis, dictating that it be sold first online, then by private retailers, rather than giving a monopoly to the LCBO, which the previous Liberal government had planned. And they've announced their intention to cap public sector wage increases at 1%. Now, whether you like this agenda or whether you don't like the agenda, I think you got to admit, Martin, it's kind of breathtaking in its, and this is a tenth of the list of accomplishments that they brought out so far. It is breathtaking in its ambitiousness, don't you think?
Recklessly so. Too much, too fast, too soon. Picking too many battles, as Fatima said, and not leaving enough bandwidth to govern in a prudent and focused and strategic way. We talked about, Matt mentioned Mike Harris, as I did earlier. Mike Harris surrounded himself, I was out of the country, but I know the people who worked for him, Leslie Noble, David Lindsay, with some of the smartest people, Deb Hutton, who you may not have agreed with their ideology, but you had to admire their ambition and their dedication and their discipline. I don't see that with this government. I see them, whether you agree with Toronto City Council being halved in seats from 50 or so or 40-something to 25, doing it in the middle of an election and risking a constitutional challenge within just a few weeks of getting power seems cuckoo pops to me.
Well, but here was the advice. Mike Harris, the former premier, and others advised Doug Ford after he won the election but before he became premier, if I had it to do all over again, I'd have gone twice as hard, twice as fast. That's what the advice was. He seems to have taken their advice.
I think he might have gone like 10 times as hard and 10 times as fast. I mean, Mike Harris did tell him twice as fast. Yeah, sure. And there's a logical reason to do that. I mean, if you come in and your self-styled mandate, if nothing else, is that you're going to rein in spending, you're going to right the fiscal ship, whatever term we want to use, yeah, you're going to have to make some painful moves. You know that early, and there's an obvious political incentive to do that as quickly as possible. But again, I think, you know, we've put up on the board there for us that list of things. Some of them went relatively smoothly. Some of them were relatively successful. One that actually wasn't on the list that I wanted to bring up was on the first day of them being in power, they changed the OHIP Plus plan.
They
was
scrapped it.
Yeah, I mean, in large part. So they have done some things, but I'm looking at that list we put up, and I'm wondering, what am I running on 3 years from now? Like, which one of these do I pluck out and go, hey, people of Ontario, look what we did? There's a couple of things in there that you could maybe cobble together as kind of a meta-narrative of, hey, we've reined in spending, or we've rationalized government services, things like that. But I didn't see any one of those files as the thing you go back to the voters with in 3 years and go, we're the government that got that done.
Well, alcohol liberalization?
Well, and allowing Ontarians to actually be adults and make choices and do things like that. But the challenge is that is a pretty solid list. It's been an ambitious first year. It has been a whirlwind, as you said at the beginning. The issue is they haven't talked about it because everyone gets focused on the other cuts, like the families with autism, who are going to be the ones that remember this in come re-election time. Most Ontarians won't. Most Ontarians won't remember the other issues that they've had in the first year. I mean, the opposition parties, of course, bring that up, but I think that there's a lot of positive narrative that they can take into the next election. They can say, yes, we dealt with the issues with respect to the labor, the 1%. We dealt with that. We dealt with other big financial issues. And now here we go, Ontario, much accomplished, more to do.
But I think that list is much shorter than the list of things that people have issues with right now. And I can't compare it to the Mike Harris government because I wasn't in Canada, didn't know Canada existed at the time. But
Were you alive at the time?
I think I was alive, yes, but very, very small, very, very small. But I think that the problem is that all of this is coming without consultation. I have yet to meet a parent who said that, yes, we've met with the government. The Environmental Commissioner of Ontario has told me she wasn't consulted before her office was cut. Students have rallied outside Queen's Park and begged to meet Rod Phillips on climate action or the education minister on the sex ed curriculum, and they have not had those meetings. I've spoken to small businesses who've tried to meet with their respective ministers, and they haven't had meetings. The fact is that this list is growing, and Ontarians are not being consulted on it. They are not being communicated to properly on the topics in question, and they're just they're waking up to headlines and being alarmed.
Okay, you're a social media person, right?
I am.
Okay, 'cause as a millennial or a social media person. Sheldon, can we go to page 9 here? Can we bring up this collage of, when the Conservative government wants to get a message out, they frequently have their cabinet ministers go do various things that highlights a message. And here we go. This was when the carbon tax kicked in. They went and, they fanned out a whole bunch of ministers and MPPs and so on, putting gas in their cars and with, suitably concerned looks on their faces about, oh, isn't this terrible? Now the carbon tax is about to hit. They did the same thing when it came to trying to purchase alcohol in a convenience store. They had ministers with concerned looks looking into refrigerators, not seeing any beer and feeling very désolé about the whole thing. I don't know, maybe I'm too old for this, but that seems very corny and ineffective.
It is.
Is it persuasive for you?
No, not at all. I think it seems like a coordinated marketing plan that just isn't working because it's easy to make fun of it than take it seriously. I made a collage of all the cap and trade when the carbon tax was going to go in effect on my birthday. I spent that evening making a collage of all their photos, and everyone just, poked fun of it. Vic Fideli's shot looked like a GQ one. There were a couple of backbenchers who just looked like they were posing for Vogue. But no one took it seriously.
We should say, I think that there's Mr. Fideli. What did you say he was? GQ?
GQ, yeah.
I think the Liberals did the same thing when they liberalized beer sales and they had people going out and, buying beer at the supermarket.
Grocery shopping at my local grocery store, and the Premier was there doing a photo op. So it's not that it's unheard of, but it's relentless. Like, it's every everyone you follow on Twitter at once. If you're, as I'm sure all of us are, as you follow all the cabinet ministers, as many of the MPPs as you can think of, it's the same thing filling your feed. The only possible silver lining, because I think it does look corny and I think it looks terrible, maybe they're betting that certain people don't follow the entirety of the cabinet or the entirety of the caucus. Maybe they follow their local person and they're hoping to get the message to those voters. To me, it seems like a bad idea, but when they rolled out the staring forlornly into convenience store fridges, I guess they either hadn't learned or they thought it worked the first time.
It's called message discipline.
Matt,
it's called message discipline, and it is corny, and it's all of those things. They're trying to use the platform, the social media platform.
Does it work?
Well, we've seen the numbers. Perhaps not.
It's not about the cornball. It's not about the messaging. It's about, does it actually make sense? And when you go out there and pretend that people are frowning because all they can find is soda pop instead of beer in their convenience stores, who thought of that? If you pretend that it is so important to fill up the day before the carbon tax comes in, and then, oops, a month later, gas prices are even lower, and a month after that, gas prices are even lower, because global effects like the Iran-American thing kind of influence gas prices far more than a carbon tax. Look, when you say that it's important to go down and put up signs that say we're open for business, and then you blow up a signed contract, and the American Chamber of Commerce and the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, but the US, the biggest business organization in the world, on the planet, says this is bad for business, then you have a contradictory message that doesn't make sense. Never mind social media or even mass media. One quick point on the cabinet changes. Everyone said a year ago, what's the difference between for then and now? And a lot of people used to say, remember, well, maybe Caroline Mulroney and Rod Phillips and Vic Fideli will restrain Doug Ford. So we're getting a good cabinet, a fresh cabinet, and yeah, we'll hold our noses about Doug Ford or whatever. We'll look the other way. And guess what? No one spoke truth to power.
Well, we don't know that. We don't know what goes on in cabinet meetings.
True, but we know what the outcomes are, and Caroline Mulroney having to defend the potential invocation of the notwithstanding clause when a former Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, said that was an awful thing to do. You can fill in some of the blanks. And there isn't, from what I hear and from what my sources tell me, there wasn't actually there were not enough cabinet ministers who were able to say to the Premier, we need to save you from yourself here, in more diplomatic words. And I think maybe going forward, they'll find their voice.
Because they're not the power.
Right?
Perhaps it's so centralized in the Premier's office, which happens with Liberals, Conservative. I mean, it's very standard in that regard, where the power in this current government lies. And perhaps maybe the cabinet ministers didn't feel they were able to communicate that to Premier Ford, or maybe there are many of them that just didn't feel that it was necessary as well. I mean, we're all so focused on the number and how terrible he's doing, and again, it does affect him, to be sure. But I don't know how much it's going to change. I don't know how much it's going to pivot this government away from doing the things that they believe they were elected by the people of Ontario to do.
Matt, I got 30 seconds left. Let me put it to you. The House is now risen. It's not coming back until after the federal election is over. Clearly, the Premier has his new team in place, this very revamped cabinet. What does this portend as far as the remainder of the term goes?
Well, I mean, for the immediate answer is the summer, they're going to start road testing probably some new messages. They're going to get their new cabinet and the caucus out there, reconnect at the local level. When they come back, we're going to see what happens. And I think, to Adrienne's point, if we don't see maybe 3 months after the House comes back that there's been some progress, that the poll numbers have improved a little bit, well, then maybe it's time for some of those cabinet ministers who might not have thought it was necessary or convenient to speak up. Maybe they're going to have to start getting loud and send the message to the Premier's office, this isn't working and we can't do this for 3 more years.
That's Matt Gurney from the National Post. You can also read his stuff on tvo.org. Adrienne Batra, editor-in-chief of the Toronto Sun, on the right-hand side of the table, politically and geographically, I guess. Regg Cohn, the Toronto Star's Ontario politics columnist, and Fatima Syed, investigative reporter, National Observer, on the left-hand side of the table. Geographically and politically, I imagine. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you coming into TVO tonight.
Thank you, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.